Since the discovery of dinosaur fossils, people have attempted to identify the presence of these creatures within the pages of the Bible. To this end, there are two creatures that have gotten the lion's share of interest: Behemoth and Leviathan, both recorded in the book of Job. Among Christian groups who champion a young Earth, it has been postulated that Leviathan is a plesiosaur, a type of aquatic dinosaur, while Behemoth may be a brachiosaurus. Operating under this assumption, groups and institutions like Answers in Genesis have used this as substance to the idea that the Bible records times when man and dinosaurs coexisted on the Earth, with the consequence being that the geological timetables need to be restructured. Are these interpretations correct? In answering this question, let's first look at Leviathan. Interpreting Leviathan as a plesiosaur or similar creature certainly does have attractive points. Leviathan is described as a sea creature, having outer armor, terrifying teeth, scales, a strong neck, and a general aura of intimidation and awe. Though these attributes seem fairly consistent with a number of possible candidates from the age of the dinosaurs, we run into a curiosity in verses 18 to 21, where Leviathan is described as a fire breather, something more akin to medieval legend than a dinosaur. Many of the same groups that defend Leviathan as being an actual creature capitulate that this must also be a real attribute of this animal.
It is chemically possible to do this, to mix chemicals together and they burn their enemy. That's what bombardier beetle does. This beetle has a cannon back near his hind end. He swings it around at the enemy and blasts his enemy with 212-degree chemicals. My fourth reason for believing in fire-breathing dragons is some of the dinosaurs had strange compartments in their head. Nobody knows for sure what they're for. The Parasaurolophus, for instance, had this weird bump on the back of his head. It's an enlargement of his sinus passages. It's hollow, and it's connected to his nasal passages. They call him the hollow-headed dinosaur. Even T-Rex had a head the size of a Volkswagen and the brain the size of a baseball. The rest of it's full of plumbing, connected to his sinuses, which means if he stored chemicals up there, he could spray them out his nose or mouth at will, or at anybody, it wouldn't have to be will, but he could spray them out, and it could have been a fire-breathing dragon. It is chemically possible. It is anatomically possible. Historically, certainly something happened, because there's an awful lot of history, and the Bible says there was one.
However, to properly understand what Leviathan is or was, we must consider the whole of the biblical text. Job chapter 41 is not the only place where this creature is described. Psalm 74 verses 13 to 14 tell us that Leviathan is a multi-headed creature. Moreover, this psalm described God as having already conquered Leviathan, giving him as food for the animals. This destruction of Leviathan begins a poetic retelling of creation that extends through verse 17, long before Job ever lived. Whereas Psalm 74 describes God as having already defeated Leviathan, Isaiah chapter 27 verse 1 prophesies that God will defeat Leviathan in the eschaton, the day of the Lord. If Leviathan is a plesiosaur, why would God be picking a fight with an aquatic animal to kickstart creation? And how is it that God has already defeated Leviathan, but must again defeat it in the eschaton? These questions, coupled with the description of seemingly mythological attributes like multiple heads and the ability to breathe fire, begins to point us in a different direction regarding Leviathan's true identity. Rather than being an ancient aquatic reptile, Leviathan is the zoomorphic representation of the forces of chaos and destruction that God is subduing to create and maintain the cosmos. The revelation of the Bible uses Leviathan as a literary device to describe God's omnipotence and authority. This is why Leviathan is described as a sea monster. In Genesis chapter 1, the creative acts of God proceed out of the primordial waters of verse 2. In Psalm 74, Leviathan is the personification of the destructive forces represented by these waters, aka the deep. It is only by God's awesome power that these forces of chaos and destruction are subdued and brought into order. Psalm 74, 13 and 14 give the poetic interpretation of this first act of creation, God ordering what otherwise refuses to be ordered. We see this understanding substantiated in Job chapter 7, verse 12. Quote, "Am I the sea or the sea monster that you set a guard over me?" This verse is part of Job's petition towards God as to why he has been the object of so much suffering. He is rhetorically asking God if his life has caused so much chaos and destruction, as much as the sea or Leviathan, that he must be ruined to restore order and peace. Job revisits God's power and authority over Leviathan and the sea, as well as over all of creation in chapter 26. Quote, "He quieted the sea with his power, and by his understanding he shattered Rahab. By his breath the heavens are cleared. His hand has pierced the fleeing serpent." These forces of chaos are not entirely absent from the creation, however. The phrase fleeing serpent in verse 13 is the same as in Isaiah 27 verse 1, Nachash Bareach. In addition, the serpentine reference of Leviathan parallels the serpent in Genesis 3, the Nachash. The serpent of Genesis 3 being an agent of chaos and rebellion akin to Leviathan. Only in the eschaton, the day of the Lord, will chaos and destruction be done away with for good, as God brings his people into his eternal kingdom, where they will finally have true peace and rest. Though motivated by good intentions, assuming Leviathan is a plesiosaur or some other great aquatic reptile does more harm than good when taken in the context of the entirety of what the Bible says about this creature. Rather than being a flesh and blood animal, Leviathan is a common literary device used to give imagery to God's great power and authority. But what about Behemoth? In a similar manner as Leviathan, Behemoth has often been taught by young Earth groups to be a biblical witness of a sauropod dinosaur that lived among human beings.
Behemoth is a dinosaur is he. He eateth grass as an ox, his tail's like a cedar tree. His bones are strong as bars of iron, he's chief in the ways of God. Could Behemoth be a dinosaur, a mighty sauropod?
An important point to consider, however, is that Behemoth is the terrestrial counterpart of Leviathan. Leviathan being a creaturely personification of aquatic forces of chaos in creation. Quote, "The fact that Behemoth appears adjacent to and paired with a fire-breathing, seven-headed chaos dragon should perhaps caution us against automatically presuming that he, Behemoth, must be a natural animal. A first clue about Behemoth's true identity can be found in the root of his name. The Hebrew word Behemoth is a word for cattle. It is sometimes also used generically as beast, though this association is along the lines of large quadrupedal animals, not unlike cattle. If Behemoth were a dinosaur, this would mean it was reptilian rather than bovine. Given the association of Behemoth with cattle rather than reptiles, this should bring pause to the consideration of Behemoth as a type of dinosaur. As Ben Stanhope points out in his book, this points to Behemoth being a type of quote-unquote super ox, a greater form of an animal that the biblical peoples would have been well acquainted with. This would go along with the Bible's explicit mention of Behemoth eating grass like an ox. Of the anatomical references that are listed in Job, it's interesting that there is no mention of Behemoth's neck. If Behemoth were a brachiosaurus or similar dinosaur, this would be one of its dominant physical characteristics. Compare this to cattle, where the neck doesn't predominate over any other portion of the body. Instead, Job draws attention to Behemoth's tail, which is described as, quote, like a cedar. It certainly appears that a brachiosaur's tail would be much more apt to fit this description than the tail of any bovine animal. However, there is more to this description than first meets the eye. Quote, "The portion of the poem describing Behemoth's body uses what scholars call list or bicola parallelism, a classic Hebrew literary technique in which each line echoes the thought of the previous. Notice that the word tail is paralleled with the Hebrew word translated thighs in the following line. This word thighs, pachad in Hebrew, only appears once in the Bible, but we know its meaning through Aramaic and a cognate Arabic word. In Aramaic literature, the word our modern English translations translate as thighs actually refers to the testicles. Thighs is a literally correct translation, but the point of the term is that it was a polite designation for what exists between the thighs. This is why the King James Version translates this word as stones, and why ancient Jewish scholars like Rashi and Ibn Ezra interpreted it as testicles. The Latin Vulgate likewise uses the word testiculorum, and some modern Hebrew experts have also opted for direct translations implying the testicles. If the word pachad, or thigh, is a euphemism for Behemoth's testicles, then the rules of parallelism would lead us to expect a similar euphemism in the description of its tail. There is some variability in how the verb associated with Behemoth's tail is translated. However, multiple translations opt for the rendering of Behemoth's tail being, quote, stiffened or, quote, made stiff. The Hebrew word here is chafetz, which literally means to take pleasure or delight in. A wooden literal translation of Job chapter 40 verse 17 would be, his tail delights like a cedar, or his tail pleases like a cedar. Given the parallel association of Behemoth's quote-unquote tail with its quote-unquote thighs, i.e. the testicles, this verb is likely being used to describe Behemoth's male virility. Thus, the quote-unquote tail is not literally its tail, but another euphemism, this time to its quote-unquote male appendage. There is no specific word for male appendage in the Bible. As a result, the biblical authors frequently use euphemisms in reference to sexual or reproductive anatomy. This sensitivity was cultural, not unlike what you generally see in our culture today. Most people don't overtly state their sexual body parts. Instead, they typically use some kind of stand-in, either of innocent or derogatory nature. The biblical writers do the same thing for the same reasons. Ancient Near Eastern cultures, of which the Hebrews and later Israelites were a part, placed a lot of value on virility and reproductive ability. At a time when food supply, and by extension the rest of everyday life, depended almost entirely on the climate, examples of plants and animals that had predominant reproductive or sexual characteristics became prized. Some pagan societies even went so far as to deify such creatures. The Bible's very reference to Behemoth's strength being in its loins captures this type of thinking. Even the Hebrews themselves reverted back to the worship of a bovine idol in the golden calf incident at Mount Sinai. Quote, in the agrarian cultures of the ancient Near East, bulls were a stock symbol of power and fertility. Thus, rather than describing the physical characteristics of a sauropod dinosaur, Job is describing a type of mythical bull or ox, a creaturely personification of the terrestrial forces of chaos on land, in opposition to Leviathan, the personification of the aquatic forces of chaos in water. Further substance to this position is in Job's reference to Behemoth dwelling among the reeds, a reference to bulls also conveyed in Psalm 68 verse 30. Together, Leviathan and Behemoth represent all of the chaotic forces of creation that man is powerless to subdue. God's declaration that he is the creator of and victor over both creatures identifies him and him alone as the one true sovereign power over the cosmos. Where God has spoken, creation and every power therein must submit to his decree. This goes back to the very first chapter of Job. Not even Satan himself can act outside of God's permission. For Job and every other person who has experienced struggle, loss, or hardship in this life, God has not forgotten about them, nor is he unable to save them in their time of need. For further reading on this and similar subjects, I recommend Misinterpreting Genesis by Ben Stanhope. You will find a link to this book in the description.